This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
Good afternoon and welcome to Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Vijay Prashad, the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies. Vijay Prashad is the author of 11 books, one of the most prolific writers of this generation. Most recently, The Darker Nations, A People's History in the Third World, New Press, 2008, which was chosen as the best nonfiction book of 2008 by the Asian American Writers Workshop. How are you doing today, Vijay?
Well, after that introduction, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Glad to finally get you on Left to Black. When I think about folks who have a real insightful view of what's happening globally, and particularly in this case around the Occupy movement, and someone who could really translate this in a way that's accessible for a wider amount of folks and do it with some humor, which is, kind of your standard style. Talk a little bit about, what you've been viewing around the Occupy movement. Is it something that's significant at this point in time? Is it something that we should be paying more attention to? Or is it just the kind of spectacle that, captures Americans' attention from time to time?
Well, to be perfectly frank, I've been waiting for this for my entire life. In 1986, I suppose, I spent maybe 10 days in a shanty town on the Diversify from South Africa movement. Mm-hmm. And I cut some of my teeth sleeping in the outside, occupying space. So I'm very happy to see large numbers of people, occupying space in our cities, occupying space in places which I guess we think of as public, but are not public at all.
No.
These are corporate spaces that masquerade as public spaces, and people have occupied them. And they've come there, after 2 decades of, I think, what we must consider to be slow and steady protest. People who've been fighting against police brutality, people fighting against homelessness, people fighting against sexual violence. These are the people who know how to come and sleep outside, who know how to come and organize things. So it's not a bunch of amateurs,
Yeah.
These are people who have been fighting on many fronts, have come out now, have said enough is enough. And because they've been fighting on many fronts, on the many fractions of grievances, there's no simple demands. They have demanded that everything is miserable because, different pieces of it are miserable to them. So I think this is an incredible opening. It has changed the public discussion. Finally, we're talking about inequality.
Yeah.
Certainly, we're not talking very smartly about how inequality functions. We're not talking about race and gender directly. But the conversation has been started, and that's a huge thing.
I think one of the things you make that's really important here, that we haven't seen this kind of level of social protests across a wide swath of folks really since the anti-apartheid protests of the 1980s. I also think about, in terms of the style of protest, the occupation movement in particular, the Tompkins Square protest, in the late 80s and early 90s in New York City. And it almost like a coming together of those two very different kind of energies. Can you unpack for a moment this 99% versus 1% formula? What I think is so interesting is that we find lots of folks, I think everybody understands what the 99% is, right? And who's in it and who's not. The 1% piece of it becomes very complicated. I almost want to say that we want to focus more on the 1% of the 1% to really talk about, because in some ways, a basketball player who a generation ago, his family was impoverished, who just happens to be worth $100 million now, is not quite the same as folks who can trace their billion-dollar empire back 2 or 3 generations.
Well, look, about 300 years ago, when the peasants were angry when my ancestors and your ancestors were angry, they would run across the field with, whatever weapons they used, to harvest the crops. And they knew where the Lord's house was. They knew precisely where the landlord lived, where the moneylender lived. They knew whose head to cut off, The problem with modern capitalism is that authority and power is extremely abstract.
Absolutely.
So if you're angry and you're homeless and, your life has suddenly given way, who do who is the enemy? Who is the problem? It's not clear where the Lord lives. We don't know where the moneylenders are. We don't have scythes. We don't have hammers. At most, we have a few skills and we look around and say, where's power? So I think one of the classic errors that people make in the modern era is we seize upon what we think of as the tangible enemy. Say the Jewish banker, and that's the heart of anti-Semitism.
Right.
Or we'll say, why is there now a black woman, senior to me in the workplace? So we'll seize upon racism.
Right.
We'll seize upon misogyny. We'll seize upon things that appear tangible. So the danger of modern abstract domination is this sort of, quick haste to find the enemy and to put flesh to them. But what the 1% tells us is it's not just about who's making $100 million, from a contract. It's about authority, it's about power, it's about control, and it's about capital. It's about the people who are able to move the public policy debate.
Right.
There's some scandalous statistics. This year, the 1% of the population got a tax cut. The average tax cut to that 1% is equal to the average income of the 99%.
Wow.
So the people we're talking about, we're not talking about Kanye West. We're talking about people whose lives are not only built of gold, but the gold is shaped like a weapon that clobbers the rest of us.
Nice.
So it's power
Great
and
metaphor.
money, not just money.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal, your host, and we're joined by Professor Vijay Prashad, the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Connecticut. He's the author of 11 books, most recently the award-winning The Darker Nations, A People's History in the Third World. Vijay, one of the things, of course, that's been very unique about this particular moment, and we can connect this to a range of social movements that have been going on the last year or so, thinking about the Arab Spring, et cetera, has been the use of social media. How effectively do you think the 99%ers, at least those who are organized on the ground in various Occupy movements, how effective have they deployed social media in terms of getting their message out and bringing, folks into the movement in that regard?
Well, in the United States, social media has been important. It was a little important in the Arab Spring, but strikingly, when Hosni Mubarak in Egypt stopped social media on January 28th, the movement peaked.
Right.
Because then people were forced to go neighborhood to neighborhood, recruiting people, bringing people out. Social media doesn't do anything. The telephone doesn't make a revolution.
Right.
The cable, when you send cables or telegraphs, they didn't do anything. You have to trust people who are out there. Mark, you know this, right? If I say to you, Mark, I'm going to go to the Occupy tomorrow, will I see you there? Then you say, well, I know him, I trust him, I'll go there.
I'll go there.
I'm not scared to go there. They're not some crazy people out there that I just saw on the internet. Trust, faith, building through the social media, but the old habits of trust, faith, breaking through the barrier of stagnation and fear of getting involved, those are extremely important. But of course, the new technologies just make it easier for people to communicate and build further those trust lines. So I think, of course, technology is important, but technology doesn't do things. It facilitates, our grievances to come out. It facilitates communication.
I know some of your opinions about our current president, and at least your level of expectation, I think much like mine, wasn't expecting much of significance would be radically changed, except making a bunch of kind of old guard racists feel very uncomfortable, as has been the case for the last 3 years. If you're in the position of being in the Obama White House, if the president calls you tomorrow and asks you to be one of his advisors on policy, what kind of instruction would you suggest to the Obama White House in terms of navigating and responding to the Occupy movement?
Well, if I was the ambassador to the OWS movement, Occupy Wall Street, what I would say, the first thing I would do, if President Obama wasn't so entirely, no, let's back up. It's not fair to him. If the Democratic and Republican parties were not so entirely bought and sold to Wall Street, I would say let the Obama administration fire Timothy Geithner, who essentially carries water for Citicorp and Goldman Sachs. I would have him fired. I would bring in an entirely new group of people to advise the administration on economic policy. I would push back so hard against the Republicans where, they would be forced to be even more open about defending the 1% than they are. I would say that my presidency is going to live and die on the passage of the Employee Free Choice Act. In other words, the right of people to form unions. President Obama, when he was candidate Obama, said he would fight for that act. In actual fact, he's done nothing to push forward that act, which would give union strength. Currently, in the private sector, only 7% of employees are unionized, which is the reason why the American people are so powerless before corporations. So I would say to him, what? I'll take the one term, but we're going to get this act pushed through. Unfortunately, they are so calculating in these major mainstream political parties that they're not willing to put everything down to protect, as it were, their base.
Yeah. We're on Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Vijay Prashad, the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Connecticut. You mentioned, Vijay, that you've been waiting for this moment for more than 20 years. Have you been surprised by it? I think many of us, when we first saw the protests in Wall Street, thought it was interesting, something that we should pay attention to. But I'm sitting here watching an Occupy Duke, I'm watching an Occupy Durham. Cornel West, at least at the time of this recording, has just recently been arrested at Occupy Harlem. Have you been surprised by the viral quality of the protests thus far?
Mark, you and I have spent our lives teaching students, and this past week, student debt has just crossed $1 trillion. Right. So you and I have seen young people walking out of our institutions hampered by, as it were, backpacks filled with bricks, essentially. Their imaginations have been constrained. They walk into your classes saying, what, Professor Anthony Neal, I cannot major in Black studies, or I cannot major in English, or I cannot major in cultural studies. My parents think I need to, major in economics or in biochemistry because I really need to get a job. Right. And so they are not able to really live in their own skin, Mark. And that frustration was boiling to a point where they were going to refuse. You link that to the fact that all those fake promises, take out these loans, go and study economics, you're going to do great, and suddenly the whole thing has collapsed. If they were not on the street, Mark, I would say we live in a country of zombies. But fortunately, these are human beings, and they have now said, enough is enough. Yeah,
it's interesting. We had a conversation with Omar Efendim, the Syrian-American rapper, a few weeks ago, and made that exact point. Have a generation of kids now who, in their minds, have done all the right things that they were supposed to. They went to the right schools, they made the right connections, had the right majors, and now they're coming out the door and can't find the kind of opportunity. So in some ways, right, when you consider the youngest quality of the protests, not just here in the United States, but even the movements that we've seen globally, and that many of them are highly educated by average standards, in some ways that part of the movement is not surprising. What is the difficulty of trying to bridge that aspect of resistance to the folks who've been on the ground, who, have been beaten up by the state now for 15, 20 years, 2 generations in some cases, who never had the kind of opportunities to go to the right schools, even on the elementary school level. You know, how do we bridge the gap between what are two very different and diverse communities of folks who are often pushing back against the same force?
Well, that is the big opportunity. You know, I don't see that as the problem. That is really the opportunity. These mainly college educated students have taken a risk. They've punctured reality, and now everybody else has to go there. You know, I've traveled to about 4 or 5 occupied sites and done a series of interviews. I found in New Haven that the New Haven occupied site is largely people who are homeless. In Hartford, it's people who are struggling against starvation. In Boston, it's people fighting student debt. You know, it's all the things you imagine. And it is the duty of people who've been fighting police brutality, who've been fighting against sexual violence, to be out there insisting that their demands be coherent demands in front of all the other demands. You know, because one of the nice things about the General Assembly model, about the open, no demand, no firm demand model, is that everything is welcome. We need to be out there hammering our 20-year-old demands. You know, we need to be arguing against the increased police state. We need to be arguing about student debt. We need to say there is no demand that is more important than any other demand. They are all equivalent, you know, and because the movement is thus far open to everything, everything needs to be right there. This is a great opportunity.
We're, of course, on Left of Black, Vijay, so in some level that speaks to our both our kind of political sensibilities. But when I see folks like Angela Davis at Occupy Wall Street, as she was at Washington Square Park a few days ago, when I see Cornel West up in Harlem, and in some ways, you know, this is the Cornel West that I'm seeing in the Occupy movement that I came of age with, that I came of maturity with, you know, in terms of someone that had that real political fire that didn't seem as though it was being generated from, you know, some sort of other thing, you know, that we've seen in his critiques of Obama. But given that kind of energy that's now out there amongst the professorate, you know, what kind of challenge do you think that folks on the left and in the academy need to be able to issue to some of our colleagues to engage in the Occupy movement, and not just in terms of the power symbolically of standing and speaking, you know, at the actual movement, but what we can do in the classroom in this regard? Yeah,
this is a great question. It's the classroom and it's the cost of what we provide. You know, we need to raise that question again. You know, why is it that the degrees at Trinity, the degrees at the other Trinity, that is Duke, why are the degrees at our institutions so expensive? You know, what is happening to young people? Are we able to provide for the real world, or are we providing for a fantasy world that's not going to be there for them? Is it true that any longer that the things you teach and that I teach are not significant for career development? What is a career? You know, what is the future for these people? I talked to middle school teachers in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the highest number of foreclosures in New England. And these teachers very forthrightly say, what are we telling our young people? Are we going to lie to them and say, you can be anything you want? You know, are we going to actually then disappoint them by saying, you're going to be nothing? You know, how do we interact with them? So we have no longer theoretically understood what it means to talk about life, love, career. You know, how do we model for people how to live in this world, not in some fantasy world? And I think that's something, you know, you and I are capable of doing. We are capable of pushing our colleagues on. We're not about career development. We are about developing lives for people. We are about cultivating life. And if we don't do that, there is no other institutional space for young people to think about what kind of lives should they lead. They look around at their communities, they look at their families. People are working way too hard. People are struggling on a treadmill. You know, what is the life we want our co-humans to live? You know, that is the kind of thing, you know, we need to push those debates fiercely. I think a coherent left in this moment isn't one that says, let the trains go faster. It's one that says, let's pull the handbrake. Let's slow the train down. And that's what you and I can do. We are capable of doing that.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony, your host. We're joined by Vijay Prashad, the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Connecticut. Vijay Prashad is the author of 11 books, most recently The Darker Nations. One of the things I've always appreciated about you, Vijay, both up close and afar, you are by far, one of the most prolific scholars of our generation. And you've done it in multiple ways, reaching a broad array of audiences. So what are you working on these days, Vijay?
Well, I have a few books coming out in the spring.
Of course
one of them is called Uncle Swami. It's the 10th year anniversary type book of my book, Karma of Brown Folk.
Right.
So it's called Uncle Swami, Being South Asian in America. And I have a book coming out in the spring called Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, which tells the story of the Libyan War. And it's actually a rather bittersweet story.
Yeah.
Because the Libyan campaign begins very bizarrely and ends terribly.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely.
it's a whole long story, Mark, and it took a lot to write that. I went to Libya once as a child and then once later, and it has marked me greatly as a young boy seeing northern Libya. And now, watching it like this, it's not really been a great, it has not been the source of pride that one saw out of Egypt or Tunisia.
Yeah. Thinking about your work in this regard, any more drive-bys by Fox News?
Well, they're always welcome. They're always welcome. They know where I live now, and yes, I know how to deal with them now.
You've been watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined by Vijay Prashad, who is the George and Martin Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies, the author of 11 books, including most recently the award-winning The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. That's New Press, 2008. Vijay, it's been great to have you on the show. I will see you in a few days at the University of Chicago, and it's great to have you on Left of Black.
Yes, looking forward to that. Thanks.
Take care.
Leave these people alone. And you as citizens, U.S., it does not make you want to do this to them. It doesn't. Stop hurting these people, man. Why y'all do this to our people? I've been to Iraq 14 months for my people. You don't let me ignore them. They don't have guns. They don't have guns. They don't. Why are you hurting these people? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. How do you sleep at night? There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this. We go occupy. The power's with the people. Don't let these cowards deceive you and be the next mouse in the talons of an eagle. This country's wealth gap is an unbalanced. It's evil. We celebrate access while the people have less, and poverty abject madness. While the economy collapses, add stress, that's the last straw. You want class, well, we'll give you what you asked for. The have-nots at the have-so. We came to crash your party, and we ain't leaving until we even. The Constitution guarantees these freedoms. Anyone against that committing treason. You're not a real patriot unless you stand for what you believe in. And nobody got more welfare than Wall Street. Hundreds of billions after operating falsely, and nobody went to prison. That's where you lost me. But my home, my job, and my life is what it cost me. We are 99. We gon' occupy. 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 Remember when police hit Egyptians who were defiant? Even President Obama condemned the violence, but when NYPD beat Americans, there's silence. It's apparent that there's bias. Six for the people, but this Karen's still a liar. Those crooked cops just for embarrassment should be fired. And if you want to see terrorists, then look higher. Stay in the skyscrapers with brilliance from my labor, forcing people out of their homes with falsified data. So it's either unify now or cry later. 1% got the wealth, but the 99's greater. So in every city we gon' occupy major, cause nobody got more welfare than Wall Street. Hundreds of billions after operating falsely, and nobody went to prison. That's where you lost me. But my home, my job, and my life is what it cost me. We are 99. We gon' occupy. 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 We gon' 99. We the 99. We gon' occupy. We gon' occupy. We the 99. We the 99. We gon' occupy.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Ms. Leyla Farah, founding partner of Cause and Effect, media marketing firm focused on the LGBT community, former vice president of programming and production of Planet Out, and the author of the new book, Black, Gifted, and Gay, which was written with Sarah Toast. How are you doing today, Leyla?
I'm doing very well. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
I love the book. It's a very beautifully done book. I love the photographs. Talk a little bit about the thinking behind doing a book like this at this time.
You know, it's really been something I've been working on for a very long time, so the timing is something I wish had happened sooner. When I started thinking about the book, I was actually looking for a book like this because I wanted to give it as a gift to a woman that I knew that was having a really difficult time accepting who she was. And I thought to myself, she was a Black woman, if I could find some kind of book, a book that would give her some frame of reference, I thought that would help. And I couldn't find anything at all like that. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. It should exist. So I started to compile this list of people that I thought were amazing and inspirational. And I started asking for input about this list and who people thought I should add to it. And it just kind of went from there.
One of the things I like, you mentioned, part of your inspiration for the book was Lorraine Hansberry's play, Young, Gifted, and Black. Nina Simone, of course, later would make a song in tribute to her. But also the wonderful book that came out 20 years ago, I Dream a World.
Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah, amazing pictorial of Black America. And I think, the thing that's really striking about your book is that it does, in fact, lean on the fact that, these are some of the most beautiful people in the world. They also strike you as folks who are could be your next door neighbor, right? Everyday kind of folks. Talk about the thinking of going into, almost demystifying, sexuality, at least as it relates to the Black community.
The LGBT community, and I'm a part of the LGBT community, so I've had this observation for a while. We're the only minority group who can't see each other. Yeah. We can't find each other visually, right? We have to identify each other in other ways. And when you realize that you're a part of this community, wherever you are in your journey there, you have to make this Herculean effort to find your own community. How do you do that? Where do you start? And especially if you're part of multiple communities, if you're also African American, and that adds in layers to your journey, it gets that much harder, right? So how do you find your way to your own community? And I think these visuals and these stories and these people who may be known to the reader anyway, act as a path to that. And that's what I wanted to create.
You're watching Left to Black. We're joined this afternoon by Ms. Leyla Farah, who's the author of the new book, Black, Gifted, and Gay. The book starts with film director, Oscar-nominated film director Lee Daniels, and ends with Wanda Sykes. Talk a little bit about what went into deciding who would show up in the book. Did you have to reach out to any of these folks to almost get permission to talk about their stories? Talk about the process a little bit.
I really wanted to find public figures. I wanted to find people that were already successful, not necessarily because they had been disclosive or not disclosive about their sexuality, but because they were just gifted, right? They were successful in their own right. I wanted to be roughly equal in terms of the numbers of men and women I chose, but other than that, I really didn't have a lot of parameters. I just asked everyone I knew who they thought should be included. And I got some fantastic recommendations, people I never would have found on my own. I did reach out to every person in the book. I heard back from the vast majority of them. Most of them were very enthusiastic about being included. I tried to use only publicly available information because I really did want to kind of establish this line of people who had made the choice to come out and were comfortable in their own sexuality. I wasn't trying to out anyone. I wasn't trying to insinuate that anyone was gay, wasn't already making that point on their own. I just wanted to kind of paint this picture of successful lives, successful people, beautiful stories, and have them all in one place.
I mean, it really is a snapshot of Black genius. And in many ways, regardless of their sexuality, it's the kind of book that you would like to pass on to young folks, to give them an example of the kind of futures they could imagine for themselves, the possibilities they have in their lives. So it's an interesting package, with regard to that. What's the response been to the book so far?
The response has been incredibly positive, and for the most part, people have just been interested in discovering new voices and new stories that they didn't already know. I think, too, that there's been an interest in having a conversation about what it means, excuse me, to be out in the African American community. So sorry. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a conversation that's kind of long overdue. Since I published the book, there have been a number of new people that have come out that I would have loved to have included, right? Don Lemon came out. I'm so proud of him for doing that. And he has such an amazing story. And I think this drumbeat of, you know what, this is who I am, and I'm happy to talk about it or not, but this is what I'm doing over here, and these are the gifts that I have to bring to the world. I think that that's really valuable.
Talk a little bit about some of the choices in the book. I'll start with Paris Barclay, whose work, and of course film director, but he also got to start 20 years ago doing music videos. I mean, he was one of the more popular directors of hip hop videos during the early days. Talk about, including someone like Paris Barclay in the mix.
That was one of the ones that was suggested to me by a very dear friend of mine, not a name I knew. Obviously someone who's incredibly accomplished in his field and has had, had the chance to dabble in a number of different art forms, but someone who's really brought, I think, a fresh vision to visual media. And that has to have had something to do with his own experiences along the way. The fact that he is also an out Black man, I think, speaks to his commitment to authenticity of vision, which comes across in the art that he makes.
LZ Granderson, who of course, we will see every afternoon on ESPN. It's a fascinating story, because what does it mean to be an out journalist in these spaces, where, particularly even the sports in general, but the coverage of sports is such a testosterone, hyper-masculine, heterosexually driven space. What does it mean for him to exist and be so very successful and visible at the same time within that space?
I think first and foremost, LZ is such a beautiful writer. Whenever he writes opinion pieces, and he's written several, some of which have to do with the LGBT community, many of which don't, he just writes beautifully, and he makes his points in very accessible ways. And that is why he's successful. He also happens to be a Black gay man, which is something that he weaves in when it's appropriate, but it's nothing that's held him back. And I think that example is what I was trying to capture. Yeah.
As we stay with the sports world, the examples of Cheryl Swoops, who came out in the last decade or so, but also John Amici, who has been very proactive, really activist-minded about challenging folks on their opinions about the LGBT community.
I would agree, and I had the opportunity to meet him when he was promoting his book, and I have a signed version of his book. I was so proud that he had done that. At the time, though, we can't forget how groundbreaking that was. Right. Just a few years later, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but that was, maybe 10-ish years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and it was huge that an athlete and that a Black man had made his story public in this way, and it certainly inspired me, and I'm hoping to make sure that it continues to inspire others.
And he's really done it with an extraordinary amount of grace. I remember when Tim Hardaway made his unfortunate comments a few years ago about, quote unquote, playing with a homosexual. And Amici has responded to those kind of challenges with a kind of grace that, is very reminiscent of the way that African Americans themselves had to navigate, very racially charged, moments early in the 20th century and the late 19th century.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And not to at all draw an absolute parallel here, but I think it's interesting that nonviolence is the response to violence, and grace is the response to hate, right? So the only way to counteract these cultural forces is to tell our stories in powerful ways and do the best we can do, and then the elements that continue to fuel the hate run out of fuel. They just fall away.
Absolutely. You're watching Left of Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by Ms. Leyla Farah, who's the founding partner of Cause and Effect, media marketing firm focused on the LGBT community. And she's authored the new book, Black, Gifted, and Gay. A couple of my favorite folks that you take a look at in the book, Felicia Snoop Pearson, who of course is well known from The Wire, and Tracy Chapman. And I'm one of the folks, I didn't know the backstory about Tracy Chapman and Alice Walker before reading the book. And so it's really interesting that you could have, two very visible, right, particularly in their own fields. Alice Walker, of course, is a broad American icon, but Tracy Chapman, has a large following, has been very successful, has a very kind of specific style that she's unique for in terms of music. What does it mean for them to try to manage this relationship, privately and publicly, for various communities?
Well, it's unfortunate that in our culture, public figures face a lot of public scrutiny, right. And I certainly don't begrudge them their privacy. They are absolutely entitled to a private life. I'm not saying that they're not. All I'm saying is that these gifts that they have been given, and Tracy Chapman is a gifted singer-songwriter, and Felicia Snoop Pearson is a gifted actress, not one who would have come along into the profession through standardized paths, right? These are gifts, and they transcend what would otherwise have held people back. So I think by shining a light on gifted people who have this one thing in common, for those people who are wrestling with their own identity, who are wrestling with their own self-expression, who are looking for some kind of shining light at the end of a dark tunnel, I'm hoping that's how this book serves its purpose.
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. If you could talk a bit about the work that you do at Cause and Effect.
Sure.
Obviously part of it is trying to help change opinions, but also make the marketplace, much more hospitable, to divert and much more diverse in many ways.
I think we really believe in the power of storytelling at Cause and Effect, and I think that our main mission is to gather and produce the stories that are the most impactful and bring the most universal kinds of messages to the marketplace. So I think we consider ourselves successful when we fill the marketplace with a variety of interesting, compelling, and impactful stories from our clients that allow there to be some breadth to the LGBT experience so that people who need to be able to find themselves in it have a place to land, right? It's not a monolithic community. It's not a monolithic experience. The more stories we tell, the more welcoming we are to those who are interested in learning about our community or finding their way to us.
Thank you. You've been watching Left to Black. I'm Mark Anthony Neal. We were joined this afternoon by Miss Leyla Farah, founding partner in Cause and Effect, a media and marketing firm focused on the LGBT community. Also the former vice president of programming and production for Planet Out, and the author of the new book, Black, Gifted, and Gay, which was written with Sarah Toast. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Leyla.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.